Welcome to the 2021 Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Scientific Symposium. We've been doing this, we believe, for 33 years, and all of them have been in person with the exception of the last two, which are virtual. I am Dr. Robert Hirschfeld. I'm professor of psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College and DeWitt Wallace Senior Scholar there. Let me, before talking about the symposium, just say something about Brain and Behavior Research Foundation to all of you who are listening, because it's really a remarkable organization, charitable organization. We are the largest private funder for research on psychiatric disorders in the world. We're surpassed in terms of funding only by large government research agencies such as the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation. We have awarded over $430 million. That's a lot of money in grants over the years. And these research grants, awards, are for individuals to do research projects at all levels of their careers, particularly early in their careers when they have some opportunities to go in a number of different directions. And we really want them, the best and the brightest, to be focusing on psychiatric disorders. What is particularly unique about Brain and Behavior Research Foundation is that among charitable organizations, we really have a very unusual situation. Most charitable organizations take a certain amount of all donations off the top to support administrative costs. And there have been some pretty bad scandals about some of those kinds of things in the past, about taking large percentages of money to go to support administrative costs and travel and so on. At Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, they take zero. That's right, zero. All of the administrative costs for running this foundation are supported by a completely separate fund, endowment. So that means that any contribution that any of you make, 100% of it, 100 cents on the dollar, will go to the research projects, which makes it a really unique and extraordinary foundation. These awards go to research, to support research programs in schizophrenia, mood disorders, autism, and a whole variety of them. What I'm going to be talking about today are to introduce people who have won major research awards for their work in schizophrenia, mood disorders, child and adolescent disorders, and cognitive neuroscience. These are senior investigators who have devoted their lives to making contributions in these. And I think you will see from that these are terrific speakers on extraordinarily interesting topics. So I just want to say a word about each of them as a way of introduction, and say just a word about each of the awards. So the first is the Libra Prize, endowed and named after Connie and Steve Lieber, who were instrumental, both deceased now, but they were both instrumental in the development of Brain and Behavior Research Foundation as it is today, and really endowed a number of the programs. The Libra Award goes for research in schizophrenia, and this year's award goes to someone from New York, near and dear, to Ezra Susser, who is at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health and the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He is professor of epidemiology and psychology, and he's done really fascinating and groundbreaking research on the determinants of the onset of neurodevelopmental disorders such as schizophrenia and autism, really looking at where these disorders come from and how they develop. And he also has done work on pandemics such as the HIV AIDS epidemic of a number of years ago, and of course the current COVID-19 pandemic. He is a true Columbia person. He received his bachelor's degree, his MD degree, his master's in public health, and his PhD, all at Columbia. He never deviated from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and he continues to have an appointment there now, as I've discussed. And he's going to be talking about living with schizophrenia during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it should be a fascinating presentation. Now, one of the nice perks that the awardee for the Libra Prize has is to actually name someone else, usually a junior colleague, whose career they wish to foster. And an award was endowed by the Maltz family for innovative schizophrenia research. And that, as I say, that awardee each year is selected by the Libra Prize awardee. And in this case, it's Ezra Susser. So this year's recipient will be Lawrence Yang, who's a PhD, got his bachelor's degree at Wesleyan in Connecticut, and then went on, stayed in the Northeast for his PhD in psychology at Boston University in Massachusetts. He is currently an associate professor of social and behavioral science at NYU and at the School of Global Public Health, and he's director of Global Mental Health and Stigma Program at the Global Center for Implementation Science at NYU. He is very interested in a particularly interesting area, which is the, quote, natural state of psychoses. That is, he's interested in what psychoses look like in the community and their untreated situation. And he actually has compared what people look like who suffer from psychoses compared with people who have been treated. He's going to be talking today about global mental health and stigma and advancing science by reaching the most vulnerable groups with psychosis. So that should be an interesting presentation. Moving on to the Colvin Prize, which was endowed by the Colvin family for research in mood disorders, particularly bipolar disorder. This year we have 3 recipients of this, this prize, 2 who do basic work and 1 clinical. The first goes to Alexander Matha, who's an MD PhD. I hope I didn't do too badly with his name. He's a faculty member at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. He actually, though, although he did train partially here in New York at Bellevue Hospital, he's interested in the role of endogenous neuropeptides in the brain, and in particular something called neuropeptide Y in the pathophysiology of depression and in the evolutionary these evolutionarily actually the peptides, neuropeptides actually proceed evolutionarily with the neurogenic amines, which many of us are more familiar with: dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, and so on. And he's found that there are low levels of neuropeptide Y in the brains of patients with bipolar disorder, which normalize with treatments, biological treatments such as lithium. And he's going to be talking today about neuropeptide Y in normal brain function and in mood disorders. Again, another very interesting presentation. The second recipient is Catherine Burdick, who's a PhD and is the Jonathan Boris Distinguished Chair in Psychiatric Epidemiology and Vice Chair for Research at the Brigham and Women's and Director of the Mood and Psychosis Research Program there, where she's an associate professor at Harvard. She received her PhD in clinical psychology at CCNY and then did a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale before coming to Boston. She has done research on neurocognitive impairment in patients with bipolar disorder and cognitive impairments in patients with bipolar disorder, which persist. These cognitive impairments often persist even in patients when they're otherwise completely well, when they're euthymic. So this notion that patients with mood disorder, particularly bipolar disorder, differ from patients with schizophrenia in that the patients with schizophrenia have all these lasting neurocognitive deficits and impairments, and patients with mood disorders is just not true. And her work has demonstrated that. She will be talking today about cognitive impairment and functional disability in bipolar disorder. How can we optimize outcomes for these patients? And then the third presentation awardee for the Colvin Mood Disorder Prize is Dr. Colleen McClung, PhD, who's from the University of Pittsburgh, where she is a professor of psychiatry and clinical and translational science and director of the Center for Adolescent Reward, Rhythms, and Sleep. As you might guess, her work has focused on the molecular basis of bipolar disorder, particularly the circadian rhythms, then the circadian genes, which are disrupted in patients with bipolar disorder. The circadian rhythms in patients with bipolar disorder are really very disrupted and abnormal sleep cycles and all of that kind of thing. She has broken down the belief that there are no animal models of bipolar disorder. And in particular, she's identified a mouse knockout gene for circadian rhythms, which disrupts the mouse's ability to adequately regulate them. And they look like, these mice, they look like they have bipolar disorder. She's going to be talking about circadian genes, rhythms, and biology of bipolar disorder. The next award is for work in child and adolescent psychiatry, and it was endowed by the Ruane family. This year, there are two awardees. The first is John Walkup, a colleague, who is a psychiatrist, MD, who is currently chair of the Pritzker Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health at the Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, and he's also director of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Northwestern University Medical School, also in Chicago. He's a Midwesterner by background, like myself, although he's from Minnesota. I'm from Michigan. He received his bachelor's degree and MD degree from the University of Minnesota, and then he trained in psychiatry, both adult and child, at Yale before going on to serve on the faculty at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He recently was the director of the Child and Adolescent program here at Weill Cornell in New York before going on to Chicago. He's known particularly for a couple different areas of research. One is movement disorders in psychiatry, particularly Tourette's disorder, which is a very disabling and difficult psychiatric movement disorder, and he's been very instrumental in developing psychopharmacologic and psychosocial interventions for this. He is all and of this and also anxiety disorders. He's very much known for in children, and then he's also done a lot of work on disparities in mental health in Native Americans compared with other people in the United States, and particularly in the areas of drug use and suicide. He's going to be talking today about clinical trials to population health, closing the mental health gap, and meeting the needs of children and families. The other recipient of the Ruane Prize for Child and Adolescent Research is Kenneth Dodge, PhD, who's professor of psychology at Duke. In fact, he's the William McConnell Distinguished Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke. He received his bachelor's degree at Northwestern in Chicago before going on to Duke University, where he got his PhD. He was on the faculty of several major universities after that: Duke, Indiana, Colorado, Vanderbilt, Stanford, and then he returned to Duke, where he is now, and his work is on developmental pathways for conduct disorder, antisocial behavior, antisocial personality, which again is a really difficult problem to treat, and certainly the people who have this disorder are extremely troubled and cause a lot of trouble for other people. So it's a very important area to be able to develop prevention programs for. And he's developed a model of how these, how the antisocial conduct disorders develop from a social perspective in childhood, and particularly that how particularly aggressive youth develop various defensive mechanisms which make life very difficult, and that this is related to early life experience. His title is The Development and Consequences and Prevention of Defensive Mindedness in Children with Conduct Disorder. The final Brain and Behavior Research Award is the Goldman-Rikich Award for Cognitive Neuroscience. It's for basic work. It is named in memory of Patricia Goldman-Rikich, who was a member of our Scientific Advisory Board and also one of the world's most highly productive and qualified neuroscientists, who unfortunately was killed in a bike accident a number of years ago. We have two recipients for that award this year. The first is Elizabeth Murray, a PhD, who is currently the chief of the Laboratory of Neuropsychological Studies and the chief of the section on neurobiology of learning and memory, both at the National Institute of Mental Health in Washington, D.C. area. She was born here in New York, got her bachelor's degree at Bucknell in Pennsylvania, and then received her PhD at UTMB, an institution I know well, and spent 25 years on the faculty there. But in any event, so she got her PhD there, and then went on to the National Institute of Health, where she has been ever since. Her work is on brain mechanisms of storing memory, specifically the temporal lobe and the hippocampus. In fact, you'll see that both of these presentations have to do with how the brain stores in memory. Very interesting work. And she's also interested in how the brain processes decision-making. So I'm looking forward to hearing what she will be talking about. The other recipient of the Goldman Merkich Award for Neuroscience is George Muzaki, who's an MD, PhD, and is the Biggs Professor of Neuroscience at NYU. He's a native of Hungary, where he received both his MD and PhD program. He then came to the United States and was at UCSD in California, that's San Diego, and at Rutgers before coming to join the faculty at NYU. His work has, as I mentioned, also been on memory, particularly the hippocampus. And in the 1980s, he introduced a concept entitled feed-forward inhibition, which is now widely accepted as the fundamental property of how neurocircuits work. And he also now subsequently developed a two-stage model of how memory is formed in the hippocampus in the brain. And he's gone on to study brain mechanisms underlying various brain rhythms, such as theta waves and all of those. So I will be in for a treat with regard to his presentation too. So we'll have these scientific presentations and then some other presentations as part of the scientific symposium. It will be a wonderful day where we will all learn a lot.